St Giles Files. Hello, welcome to the first episode of the St Giles Files. We'll start with a brief introduction just so you can get a bit of a feel for what we're going to try and do. So we are 3 staff at St Giles, and we thought at the moment we could do something different to help people carry on enjoying St Giles. Even though the building's actually closed, we are open for information. If you like what we do, or there is a specific bit that you didn't like, please do let us know by dropping us an email at info@stgilescathedral.org.uk.
St Giles stands between history and the present day. As a working parish church at the heart of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it means different things to different people. This podcast aims to address some long debated questions about St Giles, as well as offer a behind-the-scenes look at how it is run. Our focus will be historical and drawn mainly from documents in the cathedral archives, but expect a few fun anecdotes about what it means to work in one of Scotland's most popular tourist sites. While many people think of St Giles as just a church, given that, as you will find out, we've been here for nearly 1,000 years, we are much more than just a church.
Now, I think we've forgotten to introduce ourselves, Ciara. So I'm Stephen.
And I am Ciara.
And Jess will be doing the introducing part. So the format we're going for, one of us will introduce an object or a theme or an idea, and then 2 of us will debate that theme, object, or idea for the rest of the podcast. So roughly 20 minutes, half an hour is the aim. So today's object, we're striving for the top possible thing. Jess is going to introduce St Giles Cathedral, and then Ciara and I are going to discuss the final word of that, cathedral.
Yeah, I think it's a real baptism of fire, not to use a phrase that is too on the nose, but we thought we'd start big, start as we mean to go on.
Right, so let's let Jess introduce St Giles.
St Giles is a physical building, or an object, as we're gonna name it in this episode, has been added to, altered, bished, bashed, and boshed over many iterations through its long, almost 1,000-year history. I'm going to go through some of those changes to the building itself, and I'm going to mention some religious changes as they relate to that, but I'm not going to go into too much detail here because we don't have time. Okay, so the first church, which was on the spot where St Giles is now, was most likely funded by King David I of Scotland and built in 1124. David I was quite a pious, busy bee of a king. His mum was St. Margaret, so, runs in the family. And he had extensive building projects of lots of different sort of abbeys and growing cities through Scotland. So he actually also was the guy who founded Holyrood Abbey just by the palace on the other end of the Royal Mile from us. The first St. Giles Church back then was Catholic, and it was built in a more usual church-like shape than what we have today. So back then, it was a sort of truncated cross. Now I am gesturing, which is useless to you. I'm listening to audio, but basically like a kind of squished cross with rounded ends. The priest would come in at an entrance on the north door, and the congregation, or like the people, would come in at a door on the west side of the building. This early church would have been Romanesque, which means it had rounded arches, rounded doors, and was generally a lot curvier looking. This early church would have been smaller than what we have now as well, so probably around 2/3 the length of our current building. That's my guesstimate, not an official length, but I think it's about 2/3. And the building materials were different as well. So back then it was probably a lot less made of stone and more made of sort of wood, plaster, and a thatch roof. In terms of decorations inside the building, since it was Catholic back then, it would have probably had the sort of glitz and glam style of lots of different brightly colored walls through the inside. This is an incredibly niche reference, but if anybody's seen like Roman sort of statues, how they look all white now and sort of austere and fancy, when they recolor them, it's also super, super bright. So it always makes me think of that, but like a building. So now it looks all sort of like austere and simple and grand, but back then it would have been boom, 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 colors. Now, central to the whole story of St. Giles as a building as a site, as an object, if you want to think of it that way, is its position in the heart of the city of Edinburgh. So back at this early stage, in the sort of 12th century, Edinburgh as a medieval burh was mostly made up of the Royal Mile, which is also called High Street, but is usually called the Royal Mile, which is that one big street which leads from the castle up at the top, sort of on top of jaggy cliffs looking over the city, right down to Holyrood Abbey and what is now sort of that big park at the bottom of Arthur's Seat. Lots of hills. Also the Grass Market and a couple other early streets and sites, but all spreading out from that center. In 1385, there was a big old fire, and that meant that you needed lots of repairing and rebuilding, and all of that rebuilding ended up changing the structure of the church and the sort of look of it as a whole. The building and the roof were now to be thecht with stain, i.e. thatched with stone. And it was all sort of, there was a lot more stone, a lot more solidity in this new rebuilding. During this period, and for a couple hundred years after, that's when we see sort of Gothic architectural styles in churches throughout Northern Europe. And you can sort of identify that if I was saying that the earlier Norman or Romanesque style was more curvy, this is a lot more pointy. So it has sort of more triangular looking architecture at the tops of things. The different pillars were also sort of decorated as if there was a cluster of little pillars. So it's called a fluted pillar, but it's got like lots of little mini pillars all around the pillar. And I realize this is all hard to envision from a random voice in your ear rather than seeing the building itself. So we're going to have some images which we can link you to so you can better envision and understand what I'm saying. Over the 15th century, so that's in the 1400s now, lots of work was done to the building, bringing it sort of closer to its current size. So there was a huge extension eastward, and they raised the roof literally to give the church its lovely high ceilings that it's iconic for now. Towards the tail ends of the 1400s was when the crown-shaped spire, so right up at the top, was most likely installed. Zoom forward again. By 1558, St Giles was at its largest size, so big as it is now. That was also the era when we have St Giles's biggest historic claim to fame, its famous event, the main event, which was it being the home of the sort of catalyst of the Scottish Reformation in 1560. Guy called John Knox wasn't a fan of Catholic style of worship. He nipped the European continent, like the new Protestant, particularly Calvinist ideas he found there, nipped back across to Edinburgh, where he was minister at St Giles, and sort of whipped up the congregation, inspired a whole lot of new changes to Scottish society, religion, education, and the building itself. So, as it relates to the building itself, the church changed sharply from Catholic to Protestant in 1560 in the Scottish Reformation. The sort of big core part of this was that they no longer saw the Pope as a bridge between the people and God. It was more sort of simple, pared down 101. And a big part of how they, through decoration, rejected the sort of papacy's authority was rejecting what they saw as all the trappings of the Catholic Church. So they whitewashed all those colorful walls inside the church. The stained glass windows were smashed up, and they smashed a lot of other furniture, smashed the choir stalls, pared down the worship. The whole idea was to sort of pare down things to a very, very simple style of worship and style of building, really. Another big change was that they added lots of walls inside the huge building to sort of section the church off into different segments. And each of those segments would have its own parish with its own sort of congregation worshiping there. So that was between 1 and 4 different parishes inside this one building at any one time. During this period in the 16th century and the time period after in the 17th century, which I think Ciara and Stephen are going to talk about more, there were lots of different tumultuous changes in the style of worship in the building on its journey to become Presbyterian or Church of Scotland, which is what it is today. They're all really important and deserve more attention than they would be able to get here. And I'm talking about the architecture. So I'm just going to let the other two cover that, and we will skip along to early 1800s And that is when we saw two big architectural restoration projects done by two men who were both conveniently named William Burns, who was restoring the church from 1829 to 1833, and William Chambers, who was restoring the church from 1871 to 1883. And both of them really helped make the church look like it is today. All right, we've made it through Lowe's. You're almost there. If you've made it this far, kudos. So moving through the building's architectural history, thinking of it as an object, a sort of material culture object in and of itself, we have now reached the 20th century, so the 1900s. And the last little bit of the building I'm going to talk about is our Thistle Chapel. It's really well known, and it's essentially a very, very fancy building extension that's been put into the southeast corner of St. Giles, so a big old chunk of building. This chapel was designed by Sir Robert Lorimer, who was a famous Scottish architect who also worked on the War Memorial up at Edinburgh Castle. And it's got all sorts of different materials from places around Scotland. So it's got sort of marble from Iona, I think it is, woodwork, and granite from Aberdeen. So it's got all sorts of bits and bobs from different areas of the country. And it's got a beautiful high ceiling, lots of wooden carvings, including our lovely angelwood bagpipes that is all over our website, and different stained glass. And that was finished in 1911. The Thistle Chapel is fairly well known because it's the meeting place of the Queen and her Order of the Thistle. That's not architecture though, so I'll save it for another day. Okay, so we've moved right through almost 1,000 years of the history of the building of St. Giles, thinking about it as an object. So we had its different iterations, different decorations, and different religious machinations over its long lifetime. If anybody is more interested in the history, we've got a nice timeline which we've linked for you to go have a visit, and that makes up for some of the really big important stuff that I had to skip through today. Now, on to the main event. As promised, through this whole little spiel, I've called St. Giles lots of different names, so church, high kirk, and cathedral. There's a little bit of a debate about which name is the proper name. So now we're going to hear from Ciara and Stephen and see what they have to say about what it should be called. Is it St. Giles Cathedral, High Kirk, Just Kirk, or Church? Here they are.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jess. Good. Right. So, Ciara, let's now discuss what it means to be a cathedral. So what I'm going to do is I've got the easy part, I think, in that I'm going to be looking at why it should be called a cathedral, and then you're going to take over with maybe why it shouldn't be. So, I mean, well, maybe what I might do is just introduce. So, essentially, St. Giles has got tons of different names from loads of different ages. Cathedral seems to be the one that's stuck most. We'll maybe talk a bit in the discussion about the other names and what that means and if they're any good. But yeah, mainly it's St. Giles Cathedral. The reason that I think St. Giles Cathedral is kind of fine, why I'm not going to disagree with it, is in the definition of cathedral. So I think what a lot of people, and specifically I'm thinking of people that can't try to talk like this, and that say St. Giles is not a cathedral by the definition of X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z often being bishops, the kind of the Anglican or the Catholic Church. So I decided that I'd have a little Google of some definitions, as you might imagine. And I found the Cambridge Dictionary, which says a large and important church, especially one that is at the center of a large area. Now, there are loads of different definitions. So some of them will say it needs a bishop, some will say X, all that stuff. But there are loads of cathedrals all across, well, even just Scotland, there's 5. Loads across the whole of Europe that don't have bishops or that don't have one of the things, and they still manage to be cathedrals. So I'm saying, definition-wise, yeah, whilst we're not the historic definition, we are the modern definition of cathedral. What have you got?
I think that was very good. I'm a little bit disappointed that you used the Cambridge Dictionary reference as opposed to the William Chambers Dictionary reference, considering that Chambers financed our biggest restoration to date. But that's a personal choice, and you can just live with that, I suppose. So my argument is really based on the historical definition of a cathedral, and I think kind of the crux of it is that cathedral has very specific connotations to Catholic and Anglican denominations, as we've already said. And the Church of Scotland, with St Giles often being kind of at the epicenter of this, has fought very hard for its own autonomy and its own independence away from those churches. So it's interesting to me that the cathedral would still be the kind of general suffix that we use for St Giles. It was a cathedral, was made one in 1633 by Charles I, but that was a sort of period of forced episcopacy. Is that right? Episcopacy, yeah. It is a word that I have struggled with since I started working at St Giles, but I think we finally got it. And kind of became a cathedral at a time when there were a lot of English forces, actual forces and sort of cultural forces trying to take away a lot of Scotland's autonomy, religious autonomy, cultural autonomy, political autonomy, etc. And some of the events that really shaped St Giles and have kind of become the most popular stories and narratives in St Giles are specifically to do with the Church of Scotland trying to retain that independence. So the Jenny Geddes riots, for instance, when they brought in the more Anglican style of prayer book. We have a copy of the Covenant, which is a hugely important document in Scottish history, which is essentially Scottish people saying that they will have no interference with their religion from English kings. So in that sense, there's a lot of history behind St Giles that is very much about it not being a cathedral. So I just think it's interesting that we still call it that.
Yeah, and it's definitely it's a really interesting kind of argument to take, because as I say, generally the arguments are around definition, it seems, and I've never really heard the kind of the almost is cathedral against what St Giles stands for argument. It's a really interesting take on it. Most people either have a take of, I prefer this name. So like, let's say it's St Giles High Kirk. They say, well, it was the High Kirk long before it was the cathedral, and High Kirk means more and this. Whereas I've never heard anyone go, actually, maybe cathedral isn't a nice name for St Giles, which is, I think, maybe the only argument you could take. I mean, I did think it was a slam dunk for me, this one, really.
I knew you were going to say that. And I'm not going to edit that out. I want everyone who hears this to know that Stephen walked into this podcast fully prepared to win without even thinking about it. So I
mean, I'm still pretty happy that by the end of this, I'll be the winner. But I just want to say, like, good try, almost good try.
This podcast is now officially a recording of cyberbullying, and I will not be editing it out. It's staying up, and I want everyone to hear it.
But no, I mean, I get you, and I like it. I like thinking that almost, because for a lot of the other cathedrals in Scotland, especially, the names kind of weren't forced on them. I think Glasgow was a Catholic cathedral. Magnus was a Catholic cathedral, whereas St Giles wasn't. It was Charles I basically trying to say, no, my way or the highway. You're having bishops, you're becoming a cathedral. Although, interestingly, actually, so Ciara provided Jess and I with a great document summarising the arguments. So I had a little read over of that. And one of the things that I've never really thought about when St Giles was made a cathedral, because you always just get that narrative of bishops. But what I kind of thought, and maybe this counters your point kind of quite nicely, is that maybe Charles was also saying, I know James, my dad, James I was, or James VI was in Scotland quite a lot. I'm not going to be in Scotland quite a lot. But what I want to do is make sure that Edinburgh feels like a great place. So I'm going to make it a city by giving it a cathedral. So, I mean, I suppose that's maybe another way of looking at it, that it was less about the religion, although I think it was pretty much about the religion. But we could maybe hope that Charles was also thinking it's a diplomatic move as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what often kind of makes it even harder is that you can say, well, I as an individual, as a Scot, as a member of the congregation or similar, do not recognise Charles I as a sort of legitimate ruler or someone who is even allowed to do that. But St Giles is very kind of tied up in Charles I in the sense that we have a tomb to Montrose, who was one of his greatest supporters. We have a lot of his history in the cathedral. And so I think that just goes to show like how nuanced this argument can be. And I think I really like your point about it's not necessarily just about the religion, it's about recognising St Giles as an important place in Scotland. And that reminds me of an article that I read, which is a Scotsman article. It is from 1888. And it's basically having the debate that we are having now, saying, should St Giles be called a cathedral because of its kind of historical connotations? Should we just sort of let sleeping dogs lie, as it were? And there's a very nice little quote in it, which I will now read. So it goes, "The bishopric has since passed away, but Edinburgh still retains its civic dignity." And I think maybe that's a good example of the fact that the definition of cathedral has changed so greatly that it's not necessarily about the historical side of it anymore. I know I'm stepping on my own argument a bit, but I think you in the past have made some good points about how loose the definition of a cathedral has become, and perhaps how loose the definition of a city has become as well.
Yeah, but I do think that's the nugget of it almost, in that, you know, does it really matter what, I think, especially around kind of tourist attraction historical sites, people are very ready to apply the oldest version of history they can to the modern building and say, well, this is what it was, so it should still be this. But I think when we're looking at it in a modern definition or a modern sense, you know, when people come to visit places, they say, right, where do we go? Well, we go to, let's say you go to Durham, you go to the castle, you go to the cathedral. Norwich, you go to the cathedral. So in Edinburgh, well, if it wasn't the cathedral, you know, would that be confusing? I don't know if it was the High Kirk. But I also kind of think that yeah, going back to my definition point, it is interesting that people, and well, I think it's very easy to get involved in this kind of Scotland, England thing, but it's very easy for English people to say, oh, well, you Scots have done things differently. But I mean, even English cathedrals, because I was doing a bit of Googling, and being the good Lancastrian boy that I am, all my examples are from Lancashire. So, for example, Blackburn is not a city, but it has a cathedral. And Preston was made a city, I think, in 2005, but it didn't have a cathedral, although it does now. And it's a really interesting thing that I can't exactly remember the details of this, because it was only 2 days ago, which is kind of embarrassing that I can't remember. But there's a really Catholic Indian population. So supposedly the Pope made this church a cathedral to recognize this significant Catholic population there, which seems kind of fun. But yeah, I think it shows that cathedral, even by the kind of old fuddy-duddies, even that definition in the kind of the heartland of its definition isn't being followed. So why should we kind of be too concerned about it, you know, in somewhere that isn't considered a cathedral heartland, I suppose?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we have touched on this in the past, talking a bit about Anglocentrism.
Yep.
Said very slowly. I did actually practice that word before this, but it clearly didn't go very well. And this idea that that cathedrals are quite an English idea within the context of the British Isles. Is it just that because there are so many in England, and England is often quite a sort of influencing force on the rest of the British Isles? Is that why we do it? And for that reason, should it be... I don't know, can you hear the police car?
Ambulance, police car?
Yeah. They just want to get involved in the podcast. It's the talk of the town.
Yeah. Really?
Is that why we're doing it? And for that reason, should High Kirk be used because it's more about Scottish identity? But at the same time, and this is sort of something that you said that I've just made a note of, I think it's very easy as non-Scots to have a really romantic idea of Scottish history, and to sort of see Scotland as this kind of independent, like very brave, like a Braveheart-esque nation, kind of standing alone, which is all well and good. But also I think actually the Church of Scotland and Edinburgh are very inclusive cities, or very inclusive sort of places. And I think the fact that, I know you and I work full time at the cathedral, and we see people from all denominations and faiths, and sometimes no denomination or faith, coming in to light candles, or to kind of take a moment to reflect, or to say a prayer. And we very much encourage that. It's not a kind of gatekeepy sort of place, St Giles. So maybe just calling it a cathedral is a good umbrella term. You know, it doesn't...
Yeah, and I think actually picking up on that point, because loads of people do come in, and I think even kind of people with no faith, to light a candle to remember someone. And I think that even whilst it does have huge religious overtones, you could remove those overtones, and somehow lighting a candle completely removed from religion does seem like a good way of remembering someone somehow. I don't know. And yeah, I think you're right that it's almost just a nice signpost to say this is somewhere that you can do that whatever city you go to. it's worth pointing out at this stage that Edinburgh does have 3 cathedrals.
It does.
Yeah. Obviously, we're biased to saying St Giles is the best. And whilst we're talking about signposting, I would say the easiest signposted, although I suppose you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be Presbyterian. But anyway, given that the other 2 are called St Mary's, so you can have a choice of St Mary's, either Anglican or Catholic. But I think St Giles is the best cathedral.
I also think St Giles is the best cathedral. Would be more than happy for both St Mary's to do some kind of rebuttal if they would like.
Yeah. Rap battle.
Yeah. If that's what's going to get us through this quarantine, then bring it on. But I think that's a good point in the sense that, you know, if somebody wants to be quite pedantic about St Giles being a cathedral, so Edinburgh can be a city, and I have actually had this conversation with visitors before, you have 2 other like very nice cathedrals to make Edinburgh that kind of, or sort of use that definition to make Edinburgh a city. I think there's a Bishop of Edinburgh as well.
There'll be 2, won't there?
Oh yeah, that's true. So you've got 2 bishops, 2 cathedrals. The Catholic cathedral has opened, I think, in 1814, so you've had it for a long time. So I think that kind of gives St Giles a bit of breathing room to not, in terms of talking about it as a cathedral, like if you don't want to call it one and you're still kind of caught up in the terminology in terms of how it relates to a city, you can breathe easy, basically.
I mean, Ciara, I obviously have a vested interest in saying this next sentence, but I think we've kind of determined the fact that we're both quite happy with it being called a cathedral. Do you think it's worth having a bit of a chat about what other names there are to decide if one of the other names takes precedence, and cathedral, whilst we're happy that it could be called a cathedral, maybe it should be called something else? High Kirk is the one that people often throw at us. Oh, it's not the cathedral, it's the High Kirk, which I think is an odd one. Well, do you want to start off with that and then I'll maybe come back?
Yeah, it's true. I haven't come round to your way of thinking just because your argument was really good. I actually thought that first, but one of us had to take the anti-cathedral side, so I just like to put that out there, that I was no way influenced by Stephen's argument, but that was very good. So High Kirk is an interesting one. It first pops up as a definition, I think, in 1596, so before the Union of the Crowns in 1603, before there was a kind of serious worry that James I/James VI was going to start bringing in Anglican influence. So already it had very much established itself as something post-Reformation, very much away from kind of ideas of Catholicism or ideas that it might ever be a Catholic cathedral. And I think High Kirk is useful for people because it offers them an alternative. And I think that alternative is important because we have already talked about how St Giles is many different things to many different people. So maybe having multiple names, and High Kirk is it's not particularly specific, but it does very much speak to the fact that it is a Scottish church within the Church of Scotland. So I can see why people use it. I think it's a good alternative to have.
I mean, I'm going to be contrary just because I think, I should point out, I don't think the rest of these podcasts will be kind of verses. I think we're going to be a lot more just introducing ideas, but this one is very much a battle. And so in the interest of that, I'm interested in High Kirk because I think it gets abused more than cathedral almost. It's worth pointing out, for those of you who don't know, that the St Giles is a Presbyterian, has the Presbyterian style of government, which means that there's no hierarchy. I mean, there is a kind of an elected hierarchy every year, but essentially no hierarchy. And I think High Kirk almost cloudies, there's a nice word for you, kind of clouds that issue. Because people often say, and whether they're joking or not, because I think there probably is a joke around Scotland, like, ooh, the High Kirk, that it thinks itself better. But High Kirk, as far as I understand it, doesn't mean anything kind of in a grandeur, which I think St Giles, again, is often accused of. It doesn't mean anything that St Giles is better. It just means literally that it's high. You know, if you come to Edinburgh, you see the crown spire, it's quite high up. So it's the High Kirk relatively to its geography rather than in any type of, I suppose, worship sense. So I wonder, if we're not going to use cathedral, should we use High Kirk? Should we maybe just use kirk or church?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and it also speaks to the fact that at its heart, St Giles is still a parish church and still has parish services, and I think that is a really, truly important part of its identity that I think can occasionally get a little bit lost if you're focusing more on the tourist side of it. So kind of just calling it a kirk, I'm doing air quotes around just, is not a bad idea. I'll give you that one. I think we can take a step even further back and say, why is it called St Giles? St Giles is very much not a Presbyterian saint. He's
any Presbyterian.
Yeah, he's not. He's very much kind of from the Catholic canon. And so it's interesting that when they had the Reformation, that they didn't change the name. And I kind of had a little look through the archives and couldn't find anything specific about there ever being a debate about changing the name. And it seemed to me, or the impression that I got, was that even though this Reformation was kind of a huge change in Scottish life, St Giles had been there from the beginning, really. It has the name St Giles is really maybe important to the townspeople and is part of their identity.
I suppose, yeah.
They decided to keep the name St Giles because it already meant part of their identity. So perhaps that is the reason that Cathedral has stayed as well. Always.
And I think I quite like that, I suppose, in that throughout history, Cathedral has meant important building in a way that I suppose maybe church, kirk, high kirk hasn't internationally or even kind of nationally. And so maybe it's a case of, well, we have a cathedral now, even though we don't necessarily agree with the values that came with it at that initial point, we have ascribed our own set of values to it. I kind of taken your point slightly further. I think that if the Church of Scotland at its inception in 1690 or even since then, 1920, when there was a load of schisms, I think if they had felt fundamentally opposed to the idea of cathedrals, they could have got rid of all of the Scottish cathedrals, but they didn't. And so maybe, that's quite a nice point to say, we agree that they used to be something, but now we don't think of them in that way anymore. The episcopacy has gone, bishops have gone, but this word fits quite nicely, I think, for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I did this whole spiel about history and the connotations of it and why maybe cathedral is not the right word, but there's a very kind of obvious flip side of that, which is saying like cathedral acknowledges the historical events that have passed through St Giles, which I think is equally important.
Yeah. I think that's it. I think the tricky thing for us when we're looking at this name is one, what the alternatives are, but then two, whose agenda is it? And I think to some degree the agenda switches depending on, well, obviously it switches on who you're talking about, and the name switches with that agenda. So, if we want to make it seem like a building that many people will recognize wherever they're from, cathedral works quite nicely. Whereas maybe if we're serving as the main church in Scotland, which St Giles is, the Queen comes and does, well, that might be a contentious thing to say, but the Queen will do a lot of different services at St Giles throughout the year. Then High Kirk maybe serves as a nicer title because it refers more to the Scottish identity, I suppose. But I mean, I think that the tricky thing for us, Ciara, is that I think it was about 5 years ago that they had St Giles Cathedral engraved on the stone outside, which kind of not settles the issue, but certainly pushes it in one way.
That's true. I mean, I didn't really think about that. Maybe would have modified my argument a bit had I remembered that the kind of crux of the issue is literally carved into stone. But I mean, I'm sure we'll have another restoration of some kind in the next couple of years. So maybe we can, if I have ascended through the ranks of this department, I'll get someone to chisel it out. We'll see. I'm
just going to stand there with a pitchfork and just, make sure cathedral stay. Change the first bit, change it to whatever you like, but cathedral, no, it's staying.
Okay, I mean, it's a hard one to argue with. I'll give you that. It seems like a good place to kind of wrap up that debate. Seeing as it's carved in stone and there's not a lot we can do about it.
Yeah. Well, I suppose what might be quite nice is to pose a little question. Now, given that one of the nuances we seem to kind of stumble over a tiny bit was, is cathedral kind of an English phrase? What might be nice to put out as a question to folk is, if we took the idea of Scottish independence in the future, do we think that would have any bearing on St Giles' name? Because it is the kind of the central church of Edinburgh and maybe the capital. Would that change?
That is interesting. I have some thoughts on that, but I'm not going to say them. I'm going to see what our listeners have to say. And we've already mentioned that you can email us at info@stgilescathedral.org.uk. And maybe if there is something that we really like, that we think is very relevant to what we're saying, we might read it out at the beginning. And it's also a good chance to kind of have a bit more of a debate with listeners. So that would be lovely if there's something you'd like to say.
Yeah, and we do have a bank of ideas set up, but if anyone has a particular burning desire of something they've always been thinking about St Giles that they'd like us to have a delve into, then do let us know. We will not be doing genealogy. So yeah. if you if you think you're related to someone, tough. But yeah, anything other than that. Although we might talk about the idea of genealogy at some point, I don't know. Maybe not.
Maybe we'll do our genealogies, but refuse to do anyone else's. Just like really turn the tables.
I think mine's pretty boring, but yeah.
Yeah, I think mine is too. But no, I'm glad. I'm glad we have like a chance to communicate a bit more with people. The cathedral's not.
I would assume that everyone listening to this, although maybe I won't. Most podcasts feature this at some point, so here's ours. St Giles has been really, really good at keeping on all of its paid staff, which allows us to work on side projects like this whilst the building is closed. So please, if you enjoyed this, do consider donating as you are able. We will have a link on the page to donate. So yeah, please do give that a look. But if you can't, don't. Enjoy the chat, and well, hopefully enjoy the chat, and that's that.
This has been Ciara, Stephen and Jess, and you have been listening to the St Giles Files. See you next week.